Hey guys, welcome to another video. Today is going to be the final part of our 3 or 4, depending on how many videos you've been watching, part series about finishing. In the very first video, we made this basic copper ring, and we've been using this as kind of a base for all the steps after that. The second video was filing, where we got everything to shape with, files, and we also touched on burrs as well. And then we went into sanding, where we refined all of that, getting it more towards a nice polish. And today we're going to be discussing the final step, which brings out the actual shine in your work. So unlike the previous ones, where we kind of talked about using hand tools as well as power-assisted tools like the Fordham, unfortunately with polishing, to be economical with how you polish, you need to have power tools. At the very least, using a Fordham and using small buffs takes away so much time, and it adds a much greater level of finish. However, we have a full bench lathe setup, which we'll go to shortly, where we'll talk about using much larger buffs, something like this. This is, I think, a 3-inch. This is a 6-inch. These are used on the motor to buff the piece. So before we actually get into the polishing, let's talk about some of the tools that we're going to need. For starters, the biggest one is going to be a buff. And whether or not you use a big buff or a small buff, for your Fordham, it doesn't really matter. They do the same job. However, buffs are not all the same material. For example, this one is made out of muslin. It's a very common one. It's a very good mid-range. But you can also get them made out of chamois, cotton, flannel, and I'm sure there's others as well. And there's also treated. The treated ones are color-coded, and they have a certain purpose in mind. So something to consider with all of these buffs is that they do have a certain purpose. For example, yellow treated ones, none of these, are meant for very hard cutting. They're a fabric that's been treated to wear down very slowly and be very, very abrasive. So along with the material that the buff is made of, you also need to consider how firm the buff is. And that's measured by stitch count. Basically, from the middle, there's usually a spiral of stitches into the fabric, which essentially make it harder. This one has 2 stitches, and it's about, I'd say, 3/4 of an inch out from the top. So this is going to be fairly fluffy, but you'll be able to push into it and get a really nice abrasive cut on it, I suppose. This one, on the other hand, is more considered almost like a mop. It doesn't have any stitching, and you can push right in. It gets into nice little grooves very well. And it's just really good for polishing like large surfaces. So I've been mentioning the word compound. Compound is this stuff. It's this unassuming colored brick of something. It just looks dirty, it's gross. Anyway, what this is, like grit on a sandpaper, this is grit that has been mixed up with like fats and stuff. I don't know what it is, honestly. But basically you rub this onto the compound like so, while it's spinning. This then gets onto the cloth, and the cloth uses that abrasive to do the polishing. The first step is called Tripoli, and it's generally a pink color. The next one would be called Graystar. It's, as you'd imagine, gray. This is a good mid-ground, and this one starts the polishing process. And then there's Rouge. Now, they tailor Rouge depending on what you're working on. For example, this is green rouge. This one's very good for using on white metals like stainless steel, silver, nickel, just a white metal, something silvery. Red rouge is very common, and it's designed for polishing golds. Just using red rouge is a very common practice. It's a good overall. You're not really going to do too much to it if you use the wrong color rouge, but some of it is just better for others than the other colors. So just to bring this all together, what you need to do is tailor the fabric of your buff with the compound that you're using in that particular stage. For example, we're going to use a yellow treated heavy buff with our Tripoli, so it's going to take out all those 600 grit scratches and prepare the surface for progressively finer grits. So just before we get into the actual polishing, if you're following along and you're new to the jewelry journey, I suppose, you might have noticed that the Fordham flex shaft has been a staple throughout all of these steps, whether it's the filing, sanding, and now polishing. So if you don't have the machine that I have, don't worry, get one of these instead, because this is essentially the same thing. It's just a little bit smaller. You're not going to be able to work as quickly on one of the, a smaller motor, but that's okay. You can actually get a lot of good details in with something like this. So without further ado, let's go into the other room and get started on that machine. I'm also going to talk a little bit about safety, but we'll kind of overlay that with the actual polishing. So before we actually get polishing, let's just talk about the setup in general. I just want to preface that this is not my ideal setup. This is just kind of what we're dealing with at the moment. Due to the pandemic, we're waiting on a polishing machine that's been sitting, the manufacturing is very slow, but we will be getting an upgrade very shortly. I'm not going to talk too much about this particular setup because I've already reviewed it. If you want to see that, I've got a link up here somewhere. But basically how this works is a motor, the polishing lathe itself, spins. They have either one or two sides or spindles. This one has an arbor. An arbor is essentially a threaded cone. So the cloth itself threads on, and when it spins, it actually gets tighter on the thread. Like so. This particular machine is variable speed, I believe 700 RPM up to 7,000 RPM or something like that. But a more standard one is 3,450 to be exact. So right in the middle. And then this thing back here is the dust collector. It just has simple filters in it. This one's only 80 CFM. CFM stands for cubic feet per minute. It's also variable speed. It's useful. It does the job. It's better than having to wear a mask like this to keep all that dust out of your face. Now, I still recommend wearing a mask like this, especially on a small unit, because 80 CFM is really nothing. The new machine that we're going to be getting is 600 CFM, and I believe it's not quite HEPA rated, but it's pretty close. So to elaborate on safety while you watch this polishing process, these compounds are made up of very, very, very fine particulate, generally silica. Graystar is alumina, I think. Either way, these are such fine particulates that you do not want to be breathing them in. This stuff does not go away. It gets into your lungs and it basically lives there for the rest of your life. If you get too much, it becomes a symptom or a disease called silicosis, and then you basically drown in your own lungs. So let's just avoid that entirely. Wear the best mask you can for your application. If you're just going to be working for 10 minutes, maybe you can get away with it, but strongly recommend just wear your mask. Make sure you have a good dust collector with good filters. So basically, if you ignore these health procedures now, you're not going to be doing this job for very long, and it's going to affect your life down the road. So please, just for your own safety, and especially if you share the studio with other people, protect yourself and invest in the right tools for the job. So for this first stage, we're going to be starting with the copper ring, which has been sanded to 600 grit. We're very happy with the finish, so we're going to move on to this first stage of polishing, which is, as I mentioned before, called Tripoli, on this yellow treated wheel. The yellow treated ones are designed to be more rough wearing, using a stiffer grit. Tripoli is designed to remove scratches, very heavy scratches. So we're going to start with that, and we're only ever going to work on these wheels on the lower third, right around this area. This area is the safest spot. You don't want to be working on the top. You don't want to be working too far down. And these machines are very limited in where you can actually work. But either way, work in the proper place and you'll never lose control of your work. I've seen many people lose control of their work. It gets sucked in behind the motor. It gets sucked into the machine, becomes a real pain in the butt. And sometimes it can even get kicked up back by the wheel, thrown back at you. You can get winded. It can hit someone behind you. The worst story I've ever heard was actually someone getting a chipped tooth. It was an instructor and the student actually had it. It flew over his shoulder and hit her in the teeth. So now that we're done buffing with the Tripoli, you'll see that the ring has become very shiny. We're definitely getting into the actual buffing process now. But we can still make this better. So let's go to Graystar. Graystar is a great mid-ground between Tripoli with its scratch removal purposes and polishing like Rouge. This is more designed for incredibly micro scratch removal, so it's a really good mid-ground. For some things, you could actually stop with Graystar. It depends on what you're doing. We're going to work on the wheel very similar to how I do Triple E. However, we're using a different size wheel. There's no real reason for why, it just happens to be what we have. So now that we're finished with Graystar, we're going to move on into the final polish, which is Rouge. We're going to be using green Rouge on a Chamois buff. Chamois is a very, very fine fabric. It's very soft, and it really helps with the scratches. It doesn't introduce more scratches from the fabric. There's a little story I have where I was buffing a piece in college, and I had just finished my beautiful high polish. I went to go wash it with soap and water. I wiped it off with just paper towel, and I introduced more scratches onto the silver, much to my dismay. So Chamois is exactly the opposite of that. If you dry something, make sure you dry it right. Don't make more work for yourself. So something that we've kind of skipped over just for the sake of editing was the inside ring polishing. We have these special inside ring dowels, I suppose. They're an inside ring polisher. They're essentially a piece of wood shaped into a cone with felt that's been glued onto it. And then just like your buff, you apply buffing compound. So in tandem, as you're working up through these polishing compounds, you should also be polishing the inside of your ring with the same one progressively. So after you're done with Rouge, now we have to clean the ring. Believe it or not, there is compound left on this very shiny surface. So we need to get rid of that as gently as we possibly can. The most gentle way you could do it is with an ultrasonic machine. Ultrasonics are basically a heated bath that have, I really don't know what's inside there. It's probably like tortured crickets or something. But basically it just shoots these ultrasonic waves at the piece. The solution you fill it up with is also designed to cut through this polishing compound. It's like a degreaser. The ultrasonics will, now on this particular ring, it's very, very simple, but on a more complicated ring with all these little nooks and grooves and stone setting and stuff, the ultrasonic cuts into those areas and vibrates the compound out of them. The more basic route, if you don't have one of those, is Dawn dish soap and a toothbrush. Don't get a really heavy toothbrush, get like a really fine, sensitive tooth one, whatever you call them. Get a really fine one and just a little drop of Dawn, hot water, scrub it off, and it'll be clean. It'll just be clean, isn't it? So that is all for the polishing process. We now have our two very shiny, pretty rings. Bear in mind my little story of the paper towel thing. Keeping a high polish on a soft material like copper or sterling is a very difficult process. Just wearing it, wiping it on your clothes, anything is going to add scratches over time. That's pretty much universal across all metals except for some of the harder steels like stainless, platinum, and maybe some white golds. So anyway, this is a very temporary state. Bear that in mind if you're doing a photo shoot or showing clients to have a nice fresh polish, or start looking into some clear coats or just protection for your pieces. So just something to note is that high polish is not the only finish that jewelry comes in. I've had clients who prefer a satin finish, a nice brushed look with like a Scotch-Brite wheel. There's various things you can do also with patinas and coloration and all sorts of things. So if you're interested in that, comment below and I will look into finding you some of those and we can do some more videos. So that's all for our little mini course. Thank you very much for following along. If you want to see more of this content, we do offer online courses. I know that COVID has thrown a wrench into everyone's plans, so we are more than willing to do more stuff like this. At the moment, we have a wax basics course where we offer 3 different levels. We can just give you the videos, or I can send you tools and do casting for you. We're very accommodating in what we want to offer you guys. So if you like this kind of content, but you really want something more tailored to you as an individual, right below we have a membership program where if you join, we can give you more one-on-one help, be it with resins and printing, engraving as mentioned, making rings, polishing, casting, whatever you want to know. We will figure it out with you on an individual basis. So that's all I have for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.